Good afternoon and welcome to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm Marco Leona, the head of the Scientific Research Department here at the museum. It's a great pleasure to host, in collaboration with the World Science Festival, a distinguished panel of guests and for a conversation on art and the mind. I just want to introduce now Fran Riley, Chief Operating Officer of the World Science Festival. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Yes, welcome to the World Science Festival. We're so pleased that you joined us for our program, Science Sunday at the Met, Art and the Mind. We're going to get started in just a moment. Before we do, I want to thank a few of our sponsors who make this all possible. The Simons Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, ANZIF, Con Ed, the Cobley Prize, and of course, we're very grateful to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for giving us this wonderful space today. This afternoon's program will be moderated by Jamshed Bharucha. Mr. Bharucha conducts research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience, focusing on the cognitive and neural basis of the perception of music. Dr. Bharucha is the 12th president of the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. Enjoy the program.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Science Festival panel on art and the mind. And I would add to the word mind, the brain. Let's say art and the mind and the brain. We're here in the beautiful Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium at the Met. The Met being, of course, the largest museum in the United States. And a walk down one corridor can easily lead you to a famous painting, for example, Van Gogh's self-portrait with a straw hat. You may ask yourself many questions when viewing this painting or others in the museum, or sculpture or other works of art. Does it move you? Is it beautiful? Does it matter if it moves you? Does it matter if it's beautiful? What is your response to art? Is that response dependent upon your taste, upon your culture? A whole series of questions. I doubt we will get definitive answers to all of them tonight, but we certainly will address some of them. In fact, if you study art in the mind or art in the brain, you find that each new observation raises further questions. Or take an iconic piece of history displayed in the death of Socrates. What are your initial responses to this? What is going on inside your brain that you may not be aware of, but that a neuroscientist today, with techniques like MRI, might be able to detect about what's going on inside your brain? After all, as a cognitive neuroscientist, I can tell you that most of what goes on in our brains, we have no awareness of. Our conscious awareness is really the tip of the iceberg of what happens in our brain, which is why it's very important for the artists and the art historians to talk to the neuroscientists and the cognitive scientists who study the perception of art. So let me first introduce Luke Syson. Our first participant was a curator at the British Museum and then at the National Gallery in London, where he served as curator of Italian painting. His exhibitions there included Leonardo da Vinci, painter of the court of Milan. He currently serves as the Iris and B. Gerald Cantor curator in charge of the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts here at the Metropolitan Museum. You may have, as you came in, noticed the signs for a show, Plain or Fancy. Well, that is co-curated by our first guest, Luke Syson. It's called Plain or Fancy, Restraint and Exuberance in the Decorative Arts. So maybe another day you'll come back to the Met to see the show that Luke will talk about. Welcome, Luke. So Luke, among other things, you have an interest in taste, the question of taste, which is an age-old question, and how that might vary across individuals, across cultures. Tell us a bit about your thoughts about some of these and other issues, and maybe as a springboard, take us through a part of your show.
Right. Well, I've just as you kindly signaled, a little bit of advertising never does any harm, curated this show called Plain or Fancy, which in a sense left me with as many questions as it provides answers, and that's part of the point. What we've done in that exhibition is to look at a range of decorative arts objects from the late medieval period through to the early 20th century, in particular considering the people's responses to questions of ornament and plainness. The amount of work that your eye has to do for different objects, and how what one's emotional reaction is to them. And the idea very much is to get people to think about their own tastes in relation to the tastes and judgments, the priorities of the past. So people to think very much about whether their tastes are aristocratic or middle class, whether they're Protestant or Catholic. And to understand, this was our point, was to get people to understand their tastes as being about their own, as it were, cultural allegiance, their own upbringing, a whole set of things that are essentially learned. So I've come to this event with a question in mind, which is, the degree to which the kinds of objects that we're looking at have universal values, universal messages. Whether, in other words, whether the kind of analysis that we're applying is only the beginning or is in fact a second layer on top of the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about.
So would you like to walk us through some of it?
Well, we could start with a couple of the objects in the show. There is a beautiful bowl, for example, that was made for Marie Antoinette, a Sèvres piece, which has, I don't know if it's about to go, here we go, made for Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, of course, in the Sèvres factory, made for her pleasure dairy at Rambouillet. So this is what simplicity and plainness looks like if you happen to be the Queen of France. It's, from most people's points of view, a pretty fancy object, and therefore only plain, I think, in terms of our analysis, in terms of the learnt environment that she had around her, the extraordinary lavishness of the court of Versailles and other places. It was, however, thought to be so simple by the Sèvres factory when it was made, because it's not gilded, it doesn't have any gilt bronze mounts, and so on and so forth, that the factory itself worried that it was going to look barbaric. And there's a first emotional response to a piece. Clearly not one that Marie Antoinette had, and I have to say not one that I have. I find this an infinitely covetable object. And from that point of view, I've been thinking about my own tastes and what the peculiar satisfaction of this object is, and I suppose it lies in the combination of a certain kind of rigorous ornament, the very delicate colours, and above all, the symmetry of the piece. And I'm conscious that when I'm looking at a piece that proclaims its symmetricality, and you will talk about why it's actually not quite symmetrical in a second, then one of the points is to convey a sort of kind of calm, an order, a sense of well-being. And obviously, as Marie Antoinette played at being a milkmaid in this dairy, well-being and this idea of peasant simplicity lay behind it. There's an extra layer of pleasure for me in this object, which is actually, although it sets out to be symmetrical, there's some gloriously lopsided elements in it. It's actually, it's a made object, and that too has its own aesthetic appeal for me, that you can feel the hand of the craftsman at work. Another piece in the show is a big goblet, a glass goblet, which has, here we go, which was made in Holland at the beginning of the 17th century. When I first looked at it, I assumed that somehow the veining in the upper part was natural in some way, and then actually I realized that this was completely counterintuitive, that because this was a piece of glass, that wasn't possible. And going closer, when I realized that what this shows is the map of the route of the River Rhine from Mainz to Utrecht. So the funny thing about it at that point was that I was left with a whole set of contradictory responses. That first response, that I was looking at something beautiful and natural, and then a realization that actually, no, I was looking at something again that was man-made, and that provoked a completely different aesthetic response in me. And then again, that actually, although it was man-made, the ornamental features on it were natural again, were somehow drawn from the natural world. Because I think one of the questions that I hope colleagues who come on stage later will help me to understand is what the difference might be in terms of our aesthetic response to things that are made by artists as opposed to the things that we encounter in daily life. Sure.
Any other works you'd like to talk about?
Well, I also bought images of two pictures from my former life at the National Gallery in London. I wanted to start with a great Raphael painting, the Madonna of the Pinks. 10 years ago, before I turned poacher, I was gamekeeper, and my job was to keep works of art in Britain that had been there for some time. Now my aim in life is to do exactly the opposite. And for a year, I was the curator of this one picture, this little Raphael, which I had to talk about so often that actually the odd thing was that it grew richer and richer, and that's an interesting thing too, that my experience of this work grew rather than and changed, which I think was something we again might talk about. It obviously shows the Virgin and Child. It shows, and it's an image of really, in a way, perfect love. The pinks that they're holding are symbols of marriage, and so the Virgin is being presented as the bride of Christ, appropriate given that it was made for a nun in Perugia. And this glorious sense of the physicality of the two figures is very, very striking. So is the beauty and tenderness of their expressions. I got used to talking about this picture so often that if I said the phrase, "This is the most tender and intimate image of the Virgin and Child that we now have at the National Gallery," I thought I was going to melt and just sort of dissolve on the spot. But I said this once to an incoming arts minister, and after I said it, I could tell that she wasn't listening at all to anything I said after that. And I confess, I thought, bloody politicians. She's just come in to do her duty, and she's not. And she interrupted me when I was talking about infrared reflectography. I can sort of understand why she might have done. And said, "It is more tender and intimate than others. I wonder why that is." And as she left the room, she looked back at it and she said, "I see why. It's because it doesn't have any red in it." And I thought, oh, that's such an interesting observation. So again, this afternoon, I'm struck by the mood in which the colours, as well as the other ingredients of this picture, induce, and how, as an art historian, I had completely failed to notice the absence something, and so on. A last image?
Yes, one more minute.
Okay, and then we'll just very quickly. Again, to set up a set of questions, really, more than anything else. This is another National Gallery painting, Rubens, made almost exactly 100 years after the Raphael, showing the moment when Samson loses his virility, perhaps one can put it, in the lap of, certainly his strength, in the lap of Delilah. And I was interested in this work from the point of view of the discussion that we're having, because it was displayed, we know, above the chimney piece of a leading figure in Antwerp. David Friedberg, who's coming on, knows much more about this picture than I do. And yet the emotions it evokes seem to me to be really quite alarmingly sort of personal and odd when shared, in the sense that there's clearly a kind of erotic frisson in this work. And yet there's also a sense of danger and a whole set of anxieties that this picture produces, I think, to do with the colours that it has and the composition it has. And so what I'm interested in there is the question of whether the surroundings that we look at something in are also factors that need to be brought into the discussion when we think about, a pure, as it were, what's come to be called neuroaesthetic response to a work of art. So those are the things I'm hoping to find out, I must say.
Well, thank you very much, Luke, and I'm sure others will join me in coming to see the show later on. I'm sure my appreciation of the show, Plain or Fancy, will be much greater as a result.